The plaza at Olvera Street is what we think of today as the birthplace of Los Angeles, and it's here that a small monument pays tribute to Los Pobladores, the men and women as well as their children who founded Los Angeles in 1781. We all know that they arrived here from Mexico, but what most Angelinos are not aware of is that many of them were the descendants of Africans. Across town at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, an ethnically correct diorama shows the 44 settlers on their journey. They were Spaniards, Indians, and blacks, to use the historical records terminology, and they were mixtures of all three. People of Spanish and Indian ancestry were called mestizos, while people of Spanish and African ancestry were labeled mulattos. An exhibit titled Becoming Los Angeles is at the Natural History Museum and Exposition Park. It pays tribute to the outpost originally called El Pueblo de Nuestra Señora, la Reina de Los Ángeles, and the people who populated it. Today on Midday Sunday, we focus on those of African ancestry who left their indelible mark on the place most of us today just call L.A. Good Sunday morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome back Dr. William Estrada. The last time you were here, we were talking about Olvera Street, I think, right?
It was a couple of years ago.
Dr. Estrada is the author of two extremely significant books. The first is The Los Angeles Plaza, the sacred and
contested space.
I can't read that small contested space. And then the other one, the one that you're probably likely to see all around Los Angeles's Olvera Street. This is published by
Arcadia.
Yeah, Arcadia Publishing. So those two books, if you want to know about LA history, those are the books to go to look for.
Thank you.
The blacks, the people of African ancestry who came here, were they the descendants of slaves?
Yes, they were.
There was slavery in Mexico.
There was slavery in Mexico beginning in 1519, and it continued all the way up to the Mexican War for Independence. With Mexican independence in 1821, slavery was outlawed. Slavery ended. But a lot of people do not know that slavery existed in Mexico and actually flourished, especially slaves brought in to work on the coastal Veracruz, to work in the sugar fields and also in the underground mines.
You sent us a couple of images, which we'll take a look at as we talk more about this. In Mexico, were slaves treated in the same way that they were in the American South?
Exactly. Yes, they were. They were. It was chattel slavery. They were brought in to do labor as the indigenous Indian population was decimated from European introduced disease. But it's also important to understand, Tony, that the story of Africans in Mexico, if we go way back in time, really begins with the conquest of Spain by the Moors of North Africa in the 8th century. Africans have always been a presence in Spanish history, and when we get into the colonial era, there were African, not slaves, but African sailors and soldiers with Christopher Columbus in 1492. When Hernando Cortez entered Mexico through Veracruz, there were African soldiers who were part of the conquest of the Aztec Empire in Tenochtitlan.
And they were freemen, they were not slaves?
They were freemen.
Okay. One of the images we showed you, if we back up, it's a gentleman that most people, I think, familiar with Mexican history would be very surprised to realize was of African descent. There he is.
That's the second president of Mexico, Vicente Guerrero, and there is a state now named after him, and he's a hero of the Mexican War for Independence. He was a mulatto.
And once again, mulatto referring to someone of Spanish and African ancestry.
Exactly.
So it was not something that he hid or could even hide. Was he elected despite his ethnicity?
Right, because the atmosphere in colonial Spain was a lot more complicated. There wasn't this strict demarcation between black and white, between European features and African features. And especially if we get into the story of the founding of Los Angeles in the remote far north region of what was then New Spain, what one looked like, race, your phenotype, was not as important you can occupy many levels of the society. You can be a farmer, or a cowboy, a ranchero, or you can be the governor of California, like Pio Pico. And how you looked was not really the defining characteristic, but culture was the defining characteristic of who you were.
There were a total of 44 families, or 44 people who arrived here, basically 22 adults, 22 children?
22 adults, 22 children, and 4 soldiers were part of the founding of Los Angeles on or about September 4th, 1781.
We put together, our producer Kathy Kang put together a list that shows the names of the heads of households of those original settlers, along with the ethnicity, which was one of the things that the Spaniards were crazy about doing back then. So we begin with Manuel Camero, mulatto, Antonio Mesa, a black man.
It says it will say negro, and that's the term used on the census.
Right. And then Jose Cesario Moreno, also a mulatto. So we've got 3 people there with African ancestry. And we come to Jose Antonio Navarro, mestizo. Clarify that for us again.
Mestizo is the mixture between the European or Spaniard and the Indian.
Okay. Then Luis Manuel Quintero, a black man or a man of African descent.
Yes.
Pablo Rodriguez, an Indian. These would be Yaqui Indians, or do we have any?
These were Indians further into the Sonora and Sinaloa area. All of the 44 settlers of Los Angeles, or pobladores, the founders of Los Angeles, were from the remote northwest region of colonial Mexico, the Sonora and Sinaloa area, and most came from the town of Rosario in Sinaloa.
Do they have a tribal name that people would be familiar with, that you know of?
No.
Okay.
No. They came from various parts of Sonora and Sinaloa.
Right, let's pick up the list where we left off, because there were a couple of notes we needed to make about those 2. We just saw 3 of them who were of Indian ancestry. And then these 2 guys are very interesting. Jose Fernando de Velasco y Lara, listed as a Spaniard, and Antonio Clemente Feliz Villavicencio. But there's a difference between these 2 guys. They're both Spaniards, but one was born in Spain and one was born here in the New World.
Right.
And that was significant too, wasn't it?
Yeah, born in Spain and coming to California as a settler was extremely rare, and you can follow the census after 1781 to find out that the number of people actually born in Europe was, you can count them on your hand. So that's kind of a myth that California was settled by people who came from Europe. All of the people who came in this early era were from the northwest region of Mexico, and by the time of the colonization of Alta California, which began in the 1700s, this entire region was composed of people of mixed race, mulattoes, negros, indios, and they were the majority. They were not the minority. They were the majority of this region. So all of the founders of Los Angeles were of mixed race. Perhaps even this person who's listed as Spaniard, again, the census taker may have been just looking at their features and may have determined what this person was going to be listed as.
I like to, and this is probably egotistical and a sort of other things, but I like to fancy myself as a little bit of an LA historian, nothing compared to you. But you, before we started the program, you were telling me a story about how when I first started going to school, this is in the first half of the 20th century, that this kind of information about the ethnicity of Los Angeles' settlers was not common knowledge, and deliberately so.
We can look at most of the 20th century, and civic leaders, even the scholarly community, historical societies, either did not pay attention or in many instances were in denial about the true identity of the founders of Los Angeles. And again, perhaps influenced by the founders of many of our U.S. cities, especially on the East Coast, who were Europeans. So the whole concept of a multiracial, multi-ethnic city being founded in 1781 was something that people had a hard time grasping. We can call it whatever we want, but I think the city itself was in denial. But there were always people who knew the truth, and we can go back into the 1930s and 40s and thereafter, and we can see even coming out of the African American community, especially community leaders like Charlotta Bass, the publisher of the African Americans' leading newspaper in the city, the California Eagle. The newspaper always published articles, historical essays, noting the true identity of the founders of Los Angeles. So it took some time for the city itself to embrace and take pride in the multiracial, multi-ethnic origins.
We'll talk more about
founders.
that. We have to take a break. Let's take care of that. We'll be back in about 2 minutes.